If you've ever looked at ammunition boxes in a store or watched people talk about guns online, you've probably heard the terms rimfire and centerfire. At first, they sound like technical jargon that only gun enthusiasts care about. But the difference between these two cartridge types actually affects almost everything: power, reliability, cost, recoil, and even what the ammunition is used for. One is cheap, simple, and perfect for beginners. The other dominates military use, hunting, self-defense, and most modern firearms. And despite both looking almost identical from the outside, the way they ignite is completely different. So why do these two systems exist? Which came first? And why hasn't one fully replaced the other? To answer that, we need to go back to the early days of modern ammunition, right here on History of Simple Things. Before metallic cartridges existed, firearms were painfully slow to load. Shooters had to pour gunpowder down the barrel, insert a projectile, then ignite it using flintlocks or percussion caps. It worked, but it was messy, unreliable, and terrible in bad weather. Everything changed during the 1800s when inventors began combining the bullet, powder, and ignition system into a single metal cartridge. One of the earliest successful versions was the Rimfire cartridge. In 1845, French inventor Louis-Nicolas Flaubert created a primitive rimfire round using a percussion cap with a bullet attached. It didn't even contain powder at first, but it laid the foundation for future cartridge designs. Later, American companies improved the idea, eventually leading to one of the most famous cartridges ever made, the .22 Short in 1857. Rimfire ammunition became wildly popular because it was cheap and easy to manufacture. But engineers soon discovered a problem. Rimfire cartridges couldn't safely handle high pressures. As firearms became more powerful, a stronger system was needed. That led to the rise of centerfire cartridges during the late 1800s. Instead of placing the primer compound inside the rim, centerfire rounds used a separate primer located in the middle of the cartridge base. This simple change made ammunition stronger, reloadable, and capable of handling far more power. And that's why today both systems still exist side by side. A rimfire cartridge is exactly what the name suggests. The firing pin strikes the outer rim of the cartridge base. Inside that hollow rim is a tiny amount of impact-sensitive primer compound. When the firing pin crushes the rim, the primer ignites and lights the gunpowder inside the case. The most famous rimfire cartridge by far is the .22 long rifle, often called the .22 LR. It's one of the most produced ammunition types in human history. One reason rimfire ammo became so popular is because it's inexpensive. The cartridges are simple to make, use less material, and typically contain smaller amounts of powder and lead. They also produce very little recoil. That makes them ideal for beginners learning to shoot, small game hunting, pest control, and recreational target shooting, but rimfire cartridges come with limitations. Because the cartridge rim has to be thin enough to crush when struck, the brass case itself is weaker. That means rimfire rounds can't safely handle extremely high chamber pressures. Making a powerful rimfire cartridge is difficult because the casing might rupture. Another downside is reliability. Since the primer compound is spun around the inside of the rim during manufacturing, it may not distribute perfectly evenly every time. Occasionally, the firing pin strikes an area with insufficient primer material, causing a misfire. That's why rimfire ammunition is generally considered less dependable than centerfire ammunition. Centerfire cartridges solve many of those problems. Instead of placing primer material inside the rim, Centerfire cartridges use a separate metal primer seated in the center of the cartridge base. When the firing pin strikes the middle, the primer detonates and ignites the powder. This design is much stronger because the cartridge case doesn't need a crushable rim. The brass can be thicker and more durable, allowing the cartridge to withstand significantly higher pressures. That's why nearly every modern military, police, hunting, and defensive cartridge is centerfire. Popular examples include 9mm, 45 ACP, 223 Remington, 5.56 NATO, 308 Winchester, and countless others. Centerfire ammunition also has another huge advantage: reloadability. Since the primer is a separate component, shooters can remove the spent primer, insert a new one, refill the powder, and reuse the brass case multiple times. Rimfire cartridges generally cannot be reloaded safely or practically. Reliability is also better. Because the primer sits in one centralized location, ignition tends to be more consistent. Misfires are far less common compared to rimfire ammo. Of course, centerfire cartridges are usually more expensive. They require more materials, more complex manufacturing, and often use larger amounts of powder and heavier bullets. But in exchange, they offer greater power, range, durability, and performance. You might assume centerfire cartridges completely replaced rimfire long ago, but rimfire ammunition is still incredibly popular for a reason: cost. A box of rimfire ammunition is often dramatically cheaper than centerfire ammo. For people practicing marksmanship or casually target shooting, that affordability matters a lot. The low recoil also makes rimfire firearms less intimidating for beginners. A new shooter learning with a .22 LR experiences less noise, less kick, and less flinching compared to larger centerfire calibers. Hunters also continue using rimfire cartridges for small animals like rabbits and squirrels, where excessive power would damage meat or be unnecessary. In many ways, rimfire survives because it fills a niche perfectly. It's lightweight, affordable, beginner-friendly, and fun to shoot. So when you strip everything down, the difference between rimfire and centerfire cartridges comes down to one small detail: where the primer is located. But that tiny design difference completely changes how the ammunition performs. Rimfire cartridges are cheaper, lighter, and softer shooting, making them ideal for training and small game use. Centerfire cartridges are stronger, more reliable, reloadable, and powerful enough for military, hunting, and self-defense applications. And even though modern centerfire technology dominates most of the firearms world, rimfire ammunition refuses to disappear because it still does certain jobs extremely well. It's one of those rare cases where an older technology never became obsolete. Instead, it simply found its place and stayed there. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.